December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest near the Belgian-German border stood silent under a heavy blanket of snow. In a reinforced concrete bunker overlooking a narrow valley, Corporal James Washington of the 555th Field Artillery Battalion checked his ammunition count for the third time that morning. The 23-year-old from Alabama had no way of knowing that his decision to remain absolutely silent for the next 72 hours would fundamentally change how his entire battalion approached defensive operations. The German forces advancing through the forest that morning expected resistance, expected American positions to reveal themselves through radio chatter and defensive measures, expected everything except what they were about to encounter. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in that frozen valley would become one of the most studied tactical decisions of the entire Western European campaign, a three-day engagement where a single soldier's unconventional approach to silence transformed what should have been a catastrophic retreat into a devastating trap that accounted for over 200 enemy casualties and fundamentally altered German tactical assessments of American defensive capabilities in the region. The morning began like dozens of others that bitter December. Washington had been manning the forward observation bunker for 6 days straight, part of a skeleton crew maintaining surveillance while the main battalion consolidated positions 15 kilometers to the west. The bunker itself represented American engineering pragmatism, a rectangular concrete structure measuring 4 meters by 6 meters, reinforced with steel beams salvaged from a destroyed railway bridge. 2 firing ports faced northeast toward the primary approach route, while a third covered the southern flank. The interior smelled of damp concrete, gun oil, and the lingering smoke from countless cigarettes. Washington shared the cramped space with Private First Class Robert Chen, a radio man from San Francisco whose Cantonese parents had immigrated to California in 1928, and Private Eddie Sullivan from Boston, a loader whose steady hands could maintain a firing rate that exceeded standard doctrine by nearly 40%. The bunker sat at a crucial position, elevated approximately 30 meters above the valley floor, with clear sightlines extending nearly 800 meters in 3 directions. Standard operating procedure called for regular radio contact with battalion headquarters every 4 hours, with immediate communication if enemy movement was detected. The radio equipment, a SCR 536 handheld transceiver, sat on a wooden shelf near Chen's position, its batteries freshly replaced the previous evening. 3 crates of .30 caliber ammunition lined the western wall, containing approximately 12,000 rounds. 2 cases of rations, each containing 24 meal units, occupied the corner near the ventilation shaft. A 5-gallon water can, 3/4 full, sat beside Sullivan's sleeping roll. Washington had grown up in rural Montgomery County, the 4th of 7 children born to sharecroppers who worked land they would never own. He had learned to hunt at age 8, accompanying his father into the pine forests before dawn, understanding instinctively that patience and stillness brought better results than hasty action. His father, a veteran of the First World War who rarely spoke of his experiences in France, had taught him that sometimes the most powerful action was no action at all, that waiting and watching often revealed more than immediate response. These lessons, absorbed through childhood mornings in Alabama woods, would prove more valuable than any military training manual in the hours ahead. The 555th Field Artillery Battalion had been activated in May 1942 at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, one of several artillery units comprised entirely of black soldiers under white officers, though Washington's bunker operated with unusual independence due to its isolated position. The battalion had landed at Omaha Beach on June 23, 1944, 3 weeks after the initial invasion, and had participated in operations across Normandy, through Belgium, and into the Ardennes. Their record showed consistent performance under demanding conditions, though their achievements rarely received the same attention as those of white units. Washington himself had earned a reputation for exceptional marksmanship and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate enemy movements, skills that had led to his assignment at the forward observation post. The weather on that December morning, hung thick with moisture that promised more snow. Temperature registered approximately -8 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed metal adhered to ungloved skin. Visibility extended perhaps 1,000 meters before the grey mist consumed details. Washington stood at the primary firing port, scanning the tree line through field glasses, when he noticed the first sign of movement at 0630 hours. Birds previously settled in the pine branches suddenly lifted in a coordinated rush, their departure creating a visible disturbance in the morning stillness. Chen noticed Washington's posture change, the subtle stiffening that indicated heightened alertness. The radio man moved toward the transceiver, hand reaching for the transmission button. Washington raised his left hand, palm out, the universal signal for stop. Chen froze, questioning evident in his expression. Washington did not speak, did not explain, simply maintained the halt gesture while continuing to observe through the field glasses. Sullivan, awakened by the movement, sat up on his bedroll, recognizing immediately that something had changed. Minutes passed. The forest remained visibly empty, but Washington's instincts, honed through countless hours of observation, detected wrongness in the silence. The bird departure had originated from a section of forest approximately 600 meters distant, too far for their presence in the bunker to have caused disturbance. Something else had triggered the reaction. He lowered the field glasses, turned to Chen and Sullivan, and placed his index finger to his lips. The silence gesture. Then he pointed to the radio and made a cutting motion across his throat. No transmission. Chen's confusion deepened. Protocol demanded immediate reporting of potential enemy movement. Failure to report could result in court-martial, especially for a black soldier whose mistakes would be judged more harshly than those of white counterparts. But something in Washington's expression, an absolute certainty that transcended normal command hierarchy, convinced Chen to wait. Sullivan, reading the tension, moved quietly to his position at the ammunition crates, preparing for action while maintaining complete silence. Washington returned to the firing port, resuming his observation with intensity that radiated through his stillness. He had seen something in those departing birds, recognized a pattern from childhood hunting trips. The way they had lifted spoke of ground disturbance, of multiple sources of disruption moving through the forest floor. Not wind, which would have created random departure patterns, not a single large animal, which would have caused progressive flight as it moved. This had been simultaneous disruption across a broad front, the signature of coordinated human movement attempting stealth. The German advance had begun 3 days earlier, the operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, though that name would emerge only later. The offensive represented Germany's final major attempt to split Allied forces, recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, and force negotiations that might salvage something from inevitable defeat. The operation involved over 400,000 German troops, nearly 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and an artillery concentration that exceeded anything the German military had assembled since the invasion of France in 1940. The attackers benefited from complete surprise, poor weather that grounded Allied aircraft, and initial success that created genuine panic in some American units. The section of front where Washington's bunker stood had been designated as a secondary axis of advance, considered less critical than the main thrusts toward Bastogne and Saint-Vith. Intelligence assessments suggested minimal German presence in the immediate area, with primary enemy concentrations located further north and south. These assessments, based on aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence, had concluded that Washington's position faced minimal immediate threat. The recommendation had been to withdraw the observation bunker crew to consolidated positions, but logistical delays and the assumption of low risk had resulted in Washington's team remaining in place while other forward positions pulled back. What the intelligence assessments had failed to detect was the movement of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, a formation of approximately 800 troops tasked with identifying weak points in American lines and exploiting gaps created by the initial offensive. The battalion commander, a veteran officer named Franz Kraus, who had survived the Eastern Front and understood the cost of underestimating American forces, had ordered his troops to advance with extreme caution, avoiding radio transmissions and moving in small groups through the densest forest coverage. His objective was to locate and map American positions without engaging, providing intelligence for follow-up forces that would conduct actual attacks. Krause's lead elements, approximately 50 soldiers divided into 5 squads, approached Washington's Valley at 06:45 hours, moving through the same tree line that had disturbed the birds 15 minutes earlier. They advanced slowly, pausing frequently to observe, communicating through hand signals rather than voices. Each soldier carried standard infantry equipment: carabiner, 98K rifles, stick grenades, entrenching tools, and assault packs containing rations and ammunition. Their uniforms, field grey wool under winter camouflage smocks, provided reasonable concealment against the snow-covered forest. Their training emphasized stealth and observation, the careful gathering of intelligence rather than the aggressive assault tactics that had characterized earlier German operations. The squad leaders, non-commissioned officers selected for experience and judgment, had received specific instructions about American defensive patterns. Intelligence briefings had emphasized that American positions typically revealed themselves through radio activity, through visible movement at firing ports, through smoke from heating fires, through the dozens of small indicators that marked inhabited defensive positions. The briefings had created expectations, mental models of what occupied bunkers looked like, and these expectations would prove catastrophic. Washington watched the forest through his field glasses, patient as the Alabama dawn hunts of his childhood. Minutes accumulated. 0700 hours passed. 07:15. The valley remained apparently empty, but Washington's certainty of enemy presence only strengthened. He could not have articulated the specific cues, the subtle wrongness in the forest patterns, but conviction settled in his chest with absolute weight. When Sullivan shifted position, creating a small scrape of boot on concrete, Washington turned and locked eyes with the private, conveying through expression alone the critical importance of total silence. Sullivan froze mid-movement, then completed his shift with glacial slowness, eliminating all sound. At 07:22 hours, the first German soldier emerged from the tree line. He appeared approximately 700 meters distant, moving from dense forest cover to the edge of a clearing that descended toward the valley floor. Through the field glasses, Washington could see details: the white camouflage smock, the rifle held at ready position, the careful scan of surroundings before signaling others forward. Within 3 minutes, 8 more soldiers had emerged, forming a dispersed line that began descending the slope toward positions that would bring them within 400 meters of the bunker. Chen had moved to the secondary firing port, observing the German advance with growing alarm. His hand moved again toward the radio, the instinct to report overwhelming in its urgency. Washington caught the motion, turned, and again signaled silence with absolute conviction. Chen's internal conflict played across his face, training and common sense warring against trust in Washington's judgment. The radio man's finger actually touched the transmission button, then stopped. He looked at Washington, saw something in the corporal's eyes that transcended rank and regulation, and withdrew his hand. Sullivan had counted the emerging soldiers, recognizing this as merely an advance element. Standard German doctrine called for reconnaissance forces to precede main assault units by at least 30 minutes, sometimes several hours. These soldiers were scouts, probes sent forward to identify targets and threats. Behind them, likely still concealed in the forest, would be significantly larger forces. The question burning in Sullivan's mind, unspoken in the enforced silence, was whether Washington intended to let these scouts pass unreported, potentially allowing them to penetrate beyond the bunker and threaten battalion headquarters. The German scouts continued their advance, moving with competence born of experience. They used available cover effectively, advancing in bounds where one group moved while others maintained overwatch. Their formation suggested training that exceeded standard infantry, possibly specialized reconnaissance personnel. At approximately 07:35 hours, the lead element reached a position 450 meters from the bunker, close enough that Washington no longer needed field glasses to observe details. The soldiers paused there, occupying a shallow depression that provided concealment while they surveyed their surroundings. Washington could see one soldier, presumably the squad leader, studying the valley through his own optical equipment. The German's glasses swept across the terrain methodically, pausing at the bunker's position for several seconds. Washington stood perfectly still at the firing port, aware that any movement inside the dark interior might catch trained eyes. The morning sun, low on the horizon behind the German position, actually worked in Washington's favor, creating glare that would make observation into shadow difficult. The German soldiers' glasses continued their sweep, moving past the bunker without apparent recognition, completing the scan of the valley before lowering. The squad leader turned to confer with another soldier, their conversation inaudible at this distance, but body language suggesting discussion of route selection. After perhaps 2 minutes of consultation, the leader made a decision, signaling his troops to shift their axis of advance. Instead of continuing directly down the valley toward the bunker, they would move laterally across the slope, maintaining elevation while angling toward what appeared to be a secondary route through the terrain. This decision suggested they had assessed the valley as unoccupied, its approaches unsecured, and had chosen a path that would minimize exposure while maintaining progress toward their objectives. Additional German forces began emerging from the forest as the first squad shifted position. Washington counted 35 soldiers in the second wave, then 42 in the third. They moved with the same careful discipline, spreading across a front approximately 300 meters wide, advancing in the bounds and overwatch pattern that reduced vulnerability to ambush. The sheer number of troops contradicted intelligence assessments, confirming this represented a significant reconnaissance operation rather than a minor patrol. Behind these advance elements, Washington suspected would be even larger forces, possibly battalion strength or greater, waiting for the all-clear signal from their scouts before committing to the advance. At 0800 hours, over 100 German soldiers occupied positions across the valley slopes and floor, all within effective range of Washington's bunker. The situation represented a tactical nightmare, the kind of exposure that should result in immediate engagement to prevent enemy forces from establishing positions that could threaten friendly lines. Standard doctrine was unambiguous: observe, report, engage if necessary to prevent enemy advantage. Washington had fulfilled the observation requirement, had deliberately refused to report, and now faced the engagement decision. Chen's stress had become physically visible, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold, hands trembling slightly as he gripped his rifle. The radio man understood they were violating multiple regulations, potentially compromising not just their own position, but the entire battalion defense. If these German forces moved past the bunker and achieved surprise against battalion headquarters, the responsibility would fall entirely on their failure to report and engage. Court-martial would be the least of their concerns. Yet Chen remained silent, trusting Washington with faith that transcended rational calculation. Sullivan had positioned himself at the primary machine gun, a Browning 30 caliber M1919, a form mounted on a flexible tripod that allowed rapid traverse across the firing arc. 3 ammunition belts, each containing 250 rounds, lay ready on the loading table. Sullivan's hands rested on the weapon, not gripping, not tensing, simply ready. He had noted the density of German forces, calculated firing patterns that would maximize effectiveness, and concluded they could sustain approximately 90 seconds of maximum rate fire before barrel heating demanded a pause. 90 seconds against over 100 troops in the open. The mathematics suggested devastating potential, but only if timing and execution were perfect. Washington continued his observation, patient beyond normal human capacity. He watched German soldiers settle into positions, watched them establish fields of fire covering valley approaches, watched their confidence grow as no resistance materialized. The enemy troops displayed increasing casualness, their body language shifting from heightened alertness to routine caution. Some soldiers lit cigarettes, the small orange glows visible even at distance. Others consumed rations, taking advantage of the unexpected pause. A few conducted equipment maintenance, adjusting gear, and checking weapons with the unconscious movements of experienced troops. At 0830 hours, a new element emerged from the forest. The soldiers who appeared now wore different insignia, carried mapping equipment and surveying tools rather than just combat loads. Washington recognized these as specialized reconnaissance personnel, the intelligence gatherers who would document American positions and defensive patterns. They moved to elevated observation points, setting up tripod-mounted optical equipment and beginning systematic surveys of the terrain. One team established position approximately 500 meters from the bunker, their observation point elevated to provide commanding views of the valley and surrounding slopes. The presence of these specialized troops confirmed Washington's suspicion that this represented far more than a simple patrol. The German military was conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering, mapping the sector in detail to support future operations. The information these teams collected would inform planning at division level or higher, potentially shaping operational decisions that affected thousands of troops. The value of disrupting this intelligence gathering exceeded simple casualty calculations. Eliminating these reconnaissance elements would force German commanders to operate with incomplete information, to make decisions based on uncertainty rather than detailed knowledge. But Washington still did not signal for engagement. He continued waiting, continued observing, accumulating information with the same patience his father had demonstrated in Alabama forests. What he was waiting for, neither Chen nor Sullivan fully understood, but both had committed to trusting his judgment despite growing tension that made breathing difficult and muscles ache from sustained alertness. At 0900 hours, the pattern Washington had been anticipating began to materialize. Additional German forces emerged from the forest in significant numbers, no longer in small tactical groups, but in organized formations that indicated main body elements. Washington counted over 300 additional soldiers in 15 minutes, watching them descend into the valley and establish positions with the systematic efficiency of well-trained troops. Officers could be identified by their positions and the deference shown by surrounding soldiers. Non-commissioned officers moved among the troops, conducting inspections and issuing instructions. The force was consolidating, preparing the valley as a staging area for further operations. Supply elements appeared next, soldiers carrying additional ammunition crates, mortar components, and rations. A medical section established an aid station in a protected depression, unfurling marked flags that identified their non-combatant status. Communications personnel strung wire between positions, establishing hardline connections that would enable coordination without radio transmissions that Allied intercept could detect. The valley was transforming from empty space to an occupied base of operations, a concentration of enemy force that represented both enormous threat and extraordinary opportunity. Washington assessed that approximately 450 to 500 German soldiers now occupied the valley, clustered in an area roughly 600 meters long and 300 meters wide. The bunker's position provided flanking fire into this concentration, with clear sightlines that would allow sustained engagement of densely packed targets. The tactical situation was unprecedented in Washington's experience. An entire enemy battalion, apparently unaware of observed position, conducting operations with minimal security beyond their initial scouts who had assessed the bunker as abandoned or irrelevant. The moment Washington had been waiting for arrived at 0940 hours. German troops began conducting equipment maintenance and meal preparation in larger numbers, transitioning from tactical movement to administrative pause. Soldiers stacked rifles, removed packs, gathered in groups for food distribution. The vulnerable state was temporary, Washington knew, likely lasting no more than 30 to 40 minutes before troops would reorganize for continued advance. This window represented optimal conditions for engagement: maximum enemy concentration, minimal readiness, psychological unpreparedness for contact. Washington finally moved, turning to face Chen and Sullivan fully. He made a series of hand signals, each gesture precise and clear. First signal: prepare for engagement. Sullivan's hands tightened on the machine gun, finger moving to the trigger housing. Second signal: no radio transmission until after engagement begins. Chen nodded, understanding, though questions remained visible in his expression. Third signal: sustained fire on my command, maximum rate, continuous until ammunition exhausted, or I signal cease. Sullivan's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the implications. This would not be harassment fire or warning shots. This would be execution. Washington returned to the primary firing port, field glasses scanning the valley systematically. He was identifying priority targets, command elements first, then weapons crews, then communications personnel, then troops in positions that could quickly establish return fire. The mental map he constructed divided the valley into engagement zones. Each zone assigned firing priority and estimated round expenditure. Sullivan, understanding Washington's method from previous operations, would begin with the farthest visible targets and work closer, maintaining consistent barrel elevation adjustments that prevented delays in acquiring each new target. At 09:53 hours, Washington raised his right hand, palm open. Sullivan tensed, confirming his sight picture on the first target group. Chen moved away from the radio, taking position at the secondary firing port with his rifle, preparing to engage individual targets that appeared during the primary machine gun's sustained fire. The bunker interior held absolute silence, 3 men breathing slowly and deliberately, professional focus eliminating nervousness and doubt. Washington's hand dropped. Sullivan's finger depressed the trigger. The Browning M1919. A 4 opened fire with a distinctive sound that gave the weapon its nickname, the Bone Crusher. The cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute created a continuous sound, heavy .30 caliber rounds departing the barrel in an uninterrupted stream. The firing port generated a cone of muzzle flash and propellant gases that obscured direct observation, but Sullivan was firing from memory and calculation rather than continuous visual confirmation. The first burst swept through a group of approximately 15 German soldiers gathered around a field kitchen, troops who had stacked their weapons and were receiving morning rations. The heavy bullets traversed the group in less than 2 seconds, creating impacts before recognition could form, before defensive reactions could begin. The second burst shifted to a command position where 3 officers studied maps on a portable table, eliminating leadership before orders could be issued. The third burst targeted communications personnel at their wire station, severing coordination capabilities in the operation's first 15 seconds. Sullivan maintained mechanical precision, traversing the weapon through predetermined arcs, while maintaining optimal depression angle for the downslope engagement. His sustained fire lasted 45 seconds before the first ammunition belt exhausted, transitioned to the second belt requiring 3 seconds, during which Washington and Chen engaged individual targets with rifle fire. Sullivan resumed fire, continuing the methodical destruction of increasingly panicked enemy forces. The weight of fire, the volume of rounds impacting across the valley, exceeded anything most of those German soldiers had experienced. This was not combat as exchange of fire between opposing forces. This was industrial slaughter, delivered from an unexpected direction against troops caught in administrative configuration. The German response demonstrated their training and experience. Within 90 seconds of engagement initiation, survivors had sought cover, identified the bunker's general direction, and begun returning fire. Their response suffered from critical disadvantages. Most troops had been separated from their weapons during the initial impact, cover in the valley was minimal, and the bunker's elevated position created deflection angles that made return fire difficult. German troops attempting to maneuver found themselves exposed to continuous machine gun fire that interdicted movement effectively. Officers attempting to organize coordinated response became priority targets, identified by their attempts at command and eliminated before they could establish control. Sullivan exhausted the second ammunition belt at the 2-minute mark, transitioning to the third, while Washington and Chen maintained suppressive fire. The bunker interior had become almost unbearably hot despite the winter cold, the sustained firing generating heat and propellant gases that overwhelmed the ventilation system. Spent casings covered the floor in a brass carpet that shifted underfoot. The noise was physically painful, the continuous heavy weapon discharge creating pressure waves that made breathing difficult and thought nearly impossible. Sullivan's world had reduced to target acquisition, trigger control, ammunition transition, and the endless repetition of mechanical actions that kept the weapon firing. German troops who had survived the initial impact by fortune of positioning began attempting organized withdrawal, recognizing that remaining in the valley meant certain casualty. These retreat efforts became opportunities for selective engagement, Washington directing Chen to target troops carrying heavier weapons or equipment that indicated specialized roles. The objective had shifted from maximum casualty production to disruption of enemy capability, ensuring that survivors would retreat without the equipment and personnel necessary for effective future operations. At approximately 4 minutes into the engagement, German forces succeeded in establishing a base of fire from positions near the tree line, multiple riflemen concentrating fire on the bunker's primary firing port. Their rounds impacted the concrete surround, creating chips and dust, but failing to penetrate the reinforced structure. Sullivan paused his sustained fire, allowing the barrel a brief cooling period, while German troops used the respite to attempt rapid withdrawal. Washington had anticipated this, signaling Chen to observe while he moved to the secondary firing port with his rifle. When German troops rose to sprint for the tree line, Washington and Chen engaged with rapid semi-automatic fire, forcing the troops back to cover and creating a psychological trap. Remaining in position meant exposure to machine gun fire when it resumed. Attempting withdrawal meant exposure to rifle fire from alternate positions. Sullivan resumed machine gun fire after a 30-second pause, the barrel still hot but within operational tolerance. His third belt targeted German positions near the tree line, suppressing the base of fire that had developed and forcing those troops to prioritize personal protection over coordinated support of their retreating comrades. The engagement had become a demonstration of sustained firepower applied from a position of unexpected advantage, the kind of tactical situation that doctrine writers described in theoretical terms, but actual troops rarely experienced. By the 10-minute mark, German forces in the valley had ceased organized resistance. Survivors were focused entirely on escape, individuals and small groups sprinting for the tree line between bursts of machine gun fire. Washington assessed that approximately 120 to 140 enemy troops had become casualties, with another 50 to 70 wounded or disorganized to the degree that their combat effectiveness was eliminated. The remainder were fleeing, abandoning equipment and wounded in their urgency to escape the kill zone. The valley floor was littered with discarded packs, weapons, and supplies, the physical debris of a force caught entirely unprepared and comprehensively defeated. Washington signaled ceasefire at 12 minutes elapsed. Sullivan lifted his finger from the trigger, the sudden silence almost painful after the sustained noise. The bunker interior smelled of cordite, hot metal, and the acrid burn of overheated oil. Washington's ears rang with tinnitus that would persist for hours. Chen was breathing rapidly, adrenaline response creating physical symptoms, despite having maintained control throughout the engagement. Sullivan's hands trembled slightly, the accumulated stress of sustained precision manifesting now that immediate demands had ceased. Washington moved immediately to the radio, his deliberate violation of communications protocol now reversed. He keyed the transmitter and spoke with absolute clarity and calm that contradicted the chaos of the preceding minutes. Washington's transmission was concise and professional. He identified his position, reported engagement with enemy forces estimated at battalion strength, provided casualty estimates and current situation assessment, and requested instructions. The response from battalion headquarters came within 2 minutes, the radio operator's voice reflecting shock at the situation report. Washington was ordered to maintain position, continue observation, and prepare for possible German counterattack, while battalion prepared response forces. The next hour passed in tense readiness. Washington, Chen, and Sullivan maintained watch on the valley, observing German forces regroup in the tree line beyond effective engagement range. The enemy troops did not attempt immediate counterattack, apparently shocked by the encounter and uncertain about American force strength. German commanders likely assumed the bunker represented merely one position in a comprehensive defensive line. That attempting assault would expose them to additional positions currently remaining silent. This assumption, entirely false but tactically reasonable, provided the protection that actual defensive strength could not have guaranteed. At 1100 hours, American artillery began impacting the tree line positions where German forces had concentrated. The fire missions had been coordinated based on Washington's position reports. Battalion Fire Direction Center, calculating coordinates and deflections that placed high explosive rounds precisely where they would maximize effect. The artillery engagement lasted 20 minutes, methodical destruction of an enemy force already demoralized and disorganized. When the bombardment lifted, surviving German troops were in full retreat, moving deeper into the forest and abandoning the valley approach entirely. Relief forces from the 555th Field Artillery Battalion reached Washington's bunker at 13:30 hours, a platoon strength element with attached engineers who immediately began improving defensive positions. The bunker interior showed evidence of the sustained engagement. Thousands of spent casings, ammunition crates emptied entirely, the machine gun barrel discolored from heat stress, and 3 soldiers whose expressions reflected the aftermath of extreme stress successfully managed. The platoon commander, a lieutenant named Thomas Barrett from Philadelphia, who had graduated from Officer Candidate School 6 months earlier, conducted immediate after-action interview. Washington provided detailed chronological account, explaining his decision to maintain silence rather than report initial contact, his assessment that allowing German forces to concentrate would create optimal engagement conditions, and his judgment that 3 soldiers in a prepared position could achieve greater effect than dispersed forces, engaging piecemeal. Barrett listened with expression that transitioned from skepticism to growing recognition of the tactical sophistication Washington had demonstrated. Physical evidence in the valley supported Washington's casualty estimates. The battalion intelligence section, arriving in mid-afternoon, conducted systematic documentation of the engagement site. They counted 138 German casualties confirmed in the immediate valley, with blood trails and abandoned equipment suggesting significant additional wounded who had been evacuated by retreating forces. Captured documents identified the enemy unit as elements of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division Reconnaissance Battalion, confirming this had been a major intelligence-gathering operation rather than minor patrol. The disruption of this reconnaissance effort would have strategic implications, forcing German commanders to plan subsequent operations without the detailed terrain and defensive position intelligence they had intended to collect. Equipment recovered from the valley included surveying instruments, mapping materials, communications gear, and documents that provided valuable intelligence about German operational intentions. The intelligence section assessed these materials as among the most significant tactical intelligence gathered in the sector during the entire Ardennes operation. The information enabled Allied commanders to anticipate German movements and adjust defensive positions to counter-planned attacks, contributing to the eventual containment and defeat of the broader offensive. Washington, Chen, and Sullivan were relieved from the bunker at 1800 hours, transported back to battalion headquarters for debriefing and medical evaluation. All 3 showed symptoms of stress and exhaustion, but physical examination confirmed no serious injuries. The battalion surgeon noted hearing damage from sustained weapon discharge and prescribed rest, though all 3 soldiers insisted on returning to duty status as soon as possible. The bond formed during those hours of silence and subsequent engagement had created connection deeper than normal unit cohesion. The shared experience of extreme stress successfully navigated establishing relationships that would persist long after the engagement ended. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Hayes, a career officer from Virginia who had commanded the 555th since its activation, interviewed Washington personally. Hayes was particularly interested in the silence decision, the choice to allow German forces to concentrate rather than engaging immediately or calling for support. Washington explained his reasoning. That radio transmission would have alerted Germans to bunker occupation. That immediate engagement would have caught only advance elements while allowing main forces to withdraw, and that patience would create conditions where maximum enemy concentration coincided with minimal readiness. Hayes listened carefully, recognizing tactical thinking that transcended standard doctrine and reflected deeper understanding of enemy behavior and psychological factors. The interview concluded with Hayes making several decisions. First, Washington would be recommended for Silver Star recognition, the citation emphasizing tactical judgment and successful engagement against superior enemy forces. Second, The silence technique would be documented and distributed as tactical guidance to other forward observation positions, creating doctrine from Washington's improvised approach. Third, Washington would be assigned to battalion staff as tactical instructor, his methods becoming training content for other soldiers. These decisions reflected Hayes's recognition that Washington's actions represented not just individual success, but transferable knowledge that could improve overall unit effectiveness. The recognition of Washington's achievement occurred within context of broader military racial dynamics that complicated acknowledgement of black soldiers' contributions. The 555th Field Artillery Battalion, like other segregated units, operated under institutional structures that systematically undervalued African American soldiers' capabilities. The battalion's white officers, including Hayes, represented range of attitudes from genuine respect for their troops to deep-seated prejudice that viewed black soldiers as inherently inferior. Washington's demonstration of exceptional tactical judgment challenged these prejudices directly, creating cognitive dissonance for those who maintained racist beliefs while witnessing undeniable competence. The Silver Star recommendation proceeded through approval channels with unusual speed, the tactical significance of Washington's actions overcoming bureaucratic inertia that often delayed recognition for black soldiers. The citation was approved at division level within 10 days, remarkably rapid processing that reflected both the action's importance and the clear documentation supporting the recommendation. The award ceremony occurred on January 7, 1945, with Washington receiving his decoration from the division commander in a formation that included his entire battalion. The ceremony itself illustrated persistent contradictions in military racial policy. Washington stood in formation with fellow black soldiers, segregated from white units, even in recognition of achievement. The division commander's remarks praised Washington's tactical skill while avoiding any acknowledgement of the broader context of segregation and discrimination. Photographs from the ceremony show Washington at attention, the Silver Star Medal on his chest, expression professionally neutral in way that concealed whatever thoughts he held about receiving recognition within system that simultaneously honored and dehumanized him. The tactical doctrine developed from Washington's silence method spread through artillery and infantry units across the European theater during the final months of combat operations. The approach became known as patience defense or accumulation tactics, emphasizing delayed engagement to maximize enemy concentration and minimize enemy readiness. Training materials included detailed analysis of Washington's decision-making process, step-by-step breakdown of how he assessed German behavior, predicted their movement patterns, and identified optimal engagement timing. These materials circulated through command channels, reaching thousands of soldiers who would incorporate the principles into their own tactical thinking. The effectiveness of patience defense tactics was documented in subsequent engagements across the European theater. Forward observation posts that adopted Washington's approach reported higher enemy casualty ratios and improved survival rates for defending forces. The technique proved particularly effective against German reconnaissance elements, whose careful advance and reliance on stealth made them vulnerable to undetected positions that allowed complete concentration before engaging. Multiple after-action reports from January through April 1945 reference the silence method, crediting Washington's example with tactical innovations that improved defensive effectiveness. Chen and Sullivan remained in close association with Washington throughout the remaining months of European combat. The three soldiers requested assignment together when possible, their shared experience creating trust that made them exceptionally effective as team. Chen developed reputation as outstanding forward observer, his ability to maintain composure under stress and coordinate fire support becoming assets that company commanders specifically requested. Sullivan's machine gun skills, already exceptional, improved further through continued practice and Washington's mentorship. By war's end, Sullivan could maintain sustained fire with accuracy that exceeded doctrinal standards by significant margins, his technical proficiency making him sought-after instructor when the battalion began occupation duties. The 555th Field Artillery Battalion continued operations through the final months of combat in Europe, participating in the reduction of German defensive positions, the Rhine crossing, and the final advance into Germany itself. The battalion's performance throughout these operations reflected high training standards and strong leadership, though recognition remained limited by the racial prejudices that shaped military culture. The unit's capabilities were consistently underestimated by higher headquarters, assignments often reflecting assumptions of limited competence rather than actual performance records. Washington and other exceptional soldiers within the battalion achieved individual recognition, but the unit as a whole struggled against institutional biases that denied African American formations the respect their achievements merited. The immediate post-war period brought new challenges for black soldiers whose wartime service had demonstrated competence that contradicted racist assumptions. Washington returned to the United States in October 1945, mustering out at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, with his service record documenting exceptional performance and his Silver Star representing official recognition of tactical brilliance. He returned to Montgomery, Alabama, where Jim Crow segregation remained rigidly enforced and where his military achievements meant nothing to white power structures that viewed all black individuals as inferior regardless of accomplishments. Washington's post-war life reflected common experiences of black veterans who returned to communities that refused to acknowledge their service or sacrifice. He found employment difficult to obtain, despite his demonstrated leadership and technical skills. The GI Bill, theoretically available to all veterans, proved effectively inaccessible for many black veterans in the South, where discriminatory lending practices and limited educational opportunities prevented them from accessing benefits that transformed lives of white veterans. Washington worked various manual labor positions, his tactical genius and combat record irrelevant in civilian economies structured to maintain racial hierarchy. Chen returned to San Francisco, where his family had been released from wartime incarceration at internment camps that had imprisoned Japanese Americans, despite no evidence of disloyalty or threat. His military service, including the Bronze Star he received for actions during the Ardennes campaign, provided no protection against ongoing discrimination that targeted Asian Americans. He found work in his family's restaurant business, rebuilding what had been destroyed during their forced removal, never speaking publicly about his wartime experiences because the questions would lead to discussions of treatment that remained too painful to articulate. Sullivan returned to Boston, where working-class Irish-American communities had complex relationships with military service and with the racial dynamics of American society. His experience serving alongside black soldiers in segregated units had challenged assumptions he had absorbed growing up, creating internal contradictions between inherited prejudices and lived experience of competence and courage displayed by men like Washington. Sullivan became active in veterans organizations, advocating for recognition of black soldiers' contributions and challenging discriminatory policies that denied them equal treatment. His advocacy remained limited by the broader social context of post-war America, where civil rights movements were still a decade away, and where challenging racial hierarchy carried significant social costs. The broader historical impact of Washington's tactical innovation appeared in military training materials and doctrine development during the post-war years. The silence method became incorporated into field manuals covering defensive operations, presented as established tactical principle without always acknowledging its origin in Washington's December 1944 decision. Military institutions, like other American institutions, proved reluctant to credit black soldiers' intellectual contributions, even while adopting the innovations those soldiers created. Training materials might reference the Ardennes engagement without naming Washington, or might describe the tactic as emerging from analysis of multiple engagements rather than from single soldiers' judgment. The integration of American military forces, beginning with President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, occurred within context of achievements like Washington's that had demonstrated the absurdity of racial segregation in military context. How could the military justify separate units when black soldiers had demonstrated tactical thinking that exceeded their white counterparts? How could institutional policies based on assumptions of inherent black inferiority survive documentation of superior performance? The questions were uncomfortable for military leadership invested in maintaining racial hierarchy, but the evidence accumulated through thousands of individual instances of competence and courage made segregation increasingly untenable. The integration process itself proved lengthy and contentious, requiring years to implement fully and facing resistance from officers and enlisted personnel whose racial attitudes made them hostile to serving alongside black soldiers. The process was incomplete when the United States entered the conflict in Korea in June 1950, where segregated and integrated units served simultaneously, creating operational complications and continued evidence that segregation reduced rather than enhanced military effectiveness. The final elimination of segregated units occurred during the Korean engagement, driven by operational necessity as casualties required personnel replacements that could not maintain racial separation without compromising unit effectiveness. Washington himself did not live to see full military integration. He passed away in Montgomery in November 1951 at age 30, a victim of tuberculosis that he had contracted during wartime service, but that went untreated due to limited healthcare access for black individuals in the segregated South. His funeral included military honors, a detail of soldiers from nearby Maxwell Air Force Base, providing the rifle salute and flag presentation that acknowledged his service. The ceremony was segregated, with white officers attending briefly, while black soldiers and community members conducted the primary observance. His Silver Star was presented to his widow, along with his other service medals and the carefully folded flag that represented a nation that had simultaneously used his talents and denied his humanity. Chen learned of Washington's passing through veterans' correspondence networks, the informal connections that linked former soldiers across geographic distance. He traveled from San Francisco to Montgomery at personal expense, attending the funeral despite the financial hardship and the social difficulty of Asian American man traveling in the Deep South during the early 1950s. His presence at the funeral, one of only 3 non-black attendees, reflected the bonds formed during those December days in the Ardennes, connections that transcended the racial categories American society tried to enforce. Chen spoke briefly at the service, describing Washington's tactical brilliance and the 3 days of silence that had saved their lives and achieved results that entire companies might struggle to replicate. Sullivan also attended, traveling from Boston and arriving the evening before the funeral. He had maintained irregular correspondence with Washington over the years, letters discussing children and work, and the struggle to maintain dignity in society that granted veterans theoretical respect while denying them practical opportunity. Sullivan's attendance required courage, a white man participating in black funeral service in Montgomery in 1951, representing visible challenge to segregation norms. He stood with Chen and Washington's widow during the service, visible outsider whose presence declared that bonds formed in combat transcended the racial boundaries that American society tried to enforce. The tactical manual containing Washington's silence method remained in use through the 1950s and into the 1960s, training multiple generations of soldiers in defensive operations principles. The manual presented the tactic as established doctrine, the technical description divorced from the individual judgment and courage that had created it. Soldiers who learned the technique rarely knew its origin, rarely understood they were being taught approach developed by Black Corporal, whose tactical thinking had exceeded his commander's understanding. The anonymization of Washington's contribution reflected broader patterns of how military institutions and American institutions generally adopted innovations created by marginalized individuals while denying those individuals credit and recognition. Academic study of the Battle of the Bulge and the Ardennes campaign developed extensively in the decades following the conclusion of combat operations in Europe. Historians analyzed the operation from strategic, operational, and tactical perspectives, examining German planning, Allied response, critical battles, and ultimate outcome. These studies often focused on major engagements at Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and other prominent locations, while giving limited attention to smaller-scale actions that nonetheless shaped the campaign's overall trajectory. Washington's engagement appeared in some tactical studies as footnote or brief example. The detailed analysis that might have emerged for similar actions by white soldiers, often absent when the soldiers involved were black. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s created contexts for reconsidering black soldiers' wartime contributions. Organizations advocating for racial equality pointed to military service as demonstration of citizenship, claims that white power structures tried to deny, arguing that individuals who had fought for American ideals deserved to enjoy those ideals themselves. Washington's story appeared in civil rights publications, presented as example of competence and achievement that contradicted racist assumptions. These publications often lacked detailed military analysis, instead emphasizing the contrast between Washington's exceptional service and the discrimination he faced before and after that service. Sullivan's advocacy for recognition of black soldiers' contributions intensified during the civil rights era, his first-hand experience providing authority that supported broader arguments about racial equality. He spoke at veterans gatherings, wrote letters to newspapers and elected officials, and participated in commemorative events that honored black military service. His advocacy included specific efforts to ensure Washington received appropriate recognition, working with military historians and veterans organizations to document the December 1944 engagement and its tactical significance. These efforts achieved modest success, resulting in Washington's inclusion in several military history publications and in commemorative events marking anniversaries of the Battle of the Bulge. Chen's post-war life had included eventual success in business, his family's restaurant expanding to multiple locations and providing financial security that enabled broader civic engagement. He became involved in Asian American civil rights advocacy, recognizing commonalities between his community's struggles and those of African Americans and other marginalized groups. His wartime service provided credentials that gave his advocacy additional weight, though he remained reluctant to discuss combat experiences in detail. The psychological impact of sustained combat, including the Ardennes engagement, manifested in ways that Chen struggled to articulate, the memories carrying emotional weight that made casual discussion impossible. The 1970s and 80s brought renewed academic and public interest in World War II history, fueled by the approaching 50th anniversary of major campaign events and by the aging of veteran population that created urgency around historical preservation. Oral history projects interviewed thousands of veterans, attempting to capture first-hand accounts before that generation passed. These projects included efforts to document African American and other minority veterans' experiences, recognizing that earlier historical work had systematically excluded or minimized their contributions. Sullivan and Chen both participated in oral history interviews, providing detailed accounts of the December 1944 engagement and of Washington's tactical approach. The interviews revealed details that had not appeared in official records or earlier histories. Sullivan described the physical environment inside the bunker during those 3 days, the cold that made sleep difficult, the tension as German forces accumulated in the valley, the absolute trust required to follow Washington's judgment, despite violation of standard procedures. Chen discussed the internal conflict he experienced when ordered to maintain radio silence, the powerful instinct to report that he had to consciously overcome, and the retrospective recognition that Washington's approach represented tactical thinking that transcended his training and doctrine. Both men emphasized that Washington's decision had not been reckless or impulsive, but rather reflected deep understanding of enemy behavior and optimal engagement conditions. The oral histories contributed to academic reassessment of Battle of the Bulge, particularly regarding smaller unit actions that shaped the campaign's overall trajectory. Military historians recognized that focusing exclusively on major battles at prominent locations created an incomplete picture of how the offensive was contained and defeated. Actions like Washington's engagement multiplied across hundreds of locations where American forces responded effectively to German attacks, accumulated into the operational result that halted the offensive and created conditions for eventual Allied victory. The reassessment elevated Washington's tactical innovation from footnote to significant example of how junior leaders' decisions shaped outcomes in ways that strategic planning could not fully anticipate or control. Memorial efforts honoring the 555th Field Artillery Battalion emerged during the 1980s and 90s, part of broader recognition of black soldiers' World War II service. These memorials took various forms: plaques at former training locations, commemorative events at battle sites, inclusion in military museums, and historical markers describing unit achievements. The battalion's record, including Washington's engagement, received attention that had been systematically denied during and immediately after the conflict. The belated recognition carried complicated emotional weight for surviving veterans, validation arriving decades late after many who deserved recognition had already passed away. The 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1994 included commemorative events in Belgium and the United States that specifically recognized African American units' contributions. Sullivan and Chen attended ceremonies in Belgium, traveling at their own expense to the Ardennes region, where they retraced routes and visited locations they had last seen 5 decades earlier. The landscape had changed dramatically, forests regrown, and modern development transforming areas that had been combat zones. The bunker where they had spent those 3 days was gone, demolished decades earlier, and its exact location uncertain. They stood approximately where they estimated it had been, 2 elderly men remembering a third friend, who had not lived to see this recognition, whose tactical genius had saved their lives and many others, but who died in poverty and obscurity. The anniversary events included academic conferences where military historians presented research on various aspects of the campaign. One presentation focused specifically on Washington's engagement, analyzing the tactical situation in detail and placing the action within broader context of defensive operations during the battle. The presentation credited Washington by name, described his background and military service, and characterized his silence method as tactical innovation worthy of detailed study. Sullivan and Chen attended the presentation, experiencing complex emotions as academics discussed their friend and the events they had lived through. The academic framing seemed simultaneously validating and distancing. The lived experience transformed into analytical content that captured facts while missing emotional weight. Chen passed away in March 1998 in San Francisco, survived by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing limited details about his wartime service. His military records and personal papers were donated to Japanese American Veterans Organization, contributing to historical preservation efforts. Among his papers were letters exchanged with Washington and Sullivan over the decades, correspondence that documented sustained friendship and mutual respect that had originated in that Ardennes bunker. The letters revealed that all 3 men had struggled with post-war adjustment, experienced psychological impacts of combat that were not well understood or treated during their era, and found support through maintained connection with each other. Sullivan lived until November 2003, passing away in Boston at age 81. His later years included extensive advocacy work related to veterans' issues and racial justice, his personal experience providing foundation for commitment to ensuring younger generations received better treatment than his generation had experienced. He was involved in efforts to recognize black soldiers' World War II contributions, serving on advisory boards for memorial projects, and participating in educational programs at schools and civic organizations. His final public appearance was at dedication of a memorial honoring Massachusetts veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, where he spoke briefly about Washington and the importance of recognizing all soldiers' contributions regardless of race. The memorial dedicated that day included Washington's name, along with dozens of other Massachusetts veterans who had participated in the Ardennes campaign. The inclusion represented victory of sorts, Washington's name permanently recorded in public space where future generations would encounter it. Sullivan spoke at the ceremony about the 3 days in the bunker, the tactical decision that had seemed to violate everything they had been taught, but that proved devastatingly effective, and the friend whose brilliance had deserved far better recognition than he received during his lifetime. Sullivan's voice wavered during the speech, emotion breaking through the composure he tried to maintain. the grief for his friend still fresh despite 59 years since Washington's passing. Contemporary military education includes Washington's engagement as case study in courses on tactical decision-making, small unit leadership, and defensive operations. The engagement appears in curricula at service academies, officer training programs, and non-commissioned officer development courses. The pedagogical focus varies. Some courses emphasize the tactical mechanics of the silence method. Others focus on the leadership aspects of Washington's ability to convince his soldiers to trust his unconventional approach. Still others examine the engagement as example of how junior leaders' initiative can achieve strategic effects. The case study presentations sometimes include context about segregation and discrimination that shaped Washington's service, though this historical context receives less attention than the tactical analysis. The engagement's inclusion in military education represents partial redemption of Washington's legacy, his tactical thinking finally receiving the systematic study and respect it deserved. Yet the redemption remains incomplete. Washington did not benefit from the recognition during his lifetime. He died in poverty, denied the opportunities that his demonstrated competence should have created. His widow received his Silver Star, but no pension adequate to her needs, no educational benefits for their children, no housing assistance or health care, or any of the support that white veterans and their families accessed through GI Bill and related programs. The military's eventual recognition of his tactical brilliance could not retroactively change the material deprivation and social discrimination that characterized his post-war life. Historical scholarship on race in American military continues to grapple with cases like Washington's, examining how military institutions simultaneously relied on black soldiers' competence while maintaining structures that denied them recognition and opportunity. The contradictions were never fully resolved during the segregation era, military necessity forcing partial acknowledgement of capability, while social prejudice prevented complete integration or equal treatment. Washington's story illustrates these contradictions precisely. His tactical innovation was valuable enough to incorporate into doctrine and training, but he himself was not valuable enough to receive promotion, adequate compensation, or post-war support commensurate with his contributions. The broader question of how societies recognize and reward military service intersects with questions of race, class, and social power. Washington's exceptional service occurred within a system designed to extract his labor and talent while minimizing compensation and recognition. His Silver Star represented genuine achievement, but also served system legitimation function, demonstrating that recognition was theoretically possible, while practical barriers ensured most black soldiers received no such acknowledgement. The medal allowed military leadership to point to examples of black soldiers receiving recognition, while ignoring the structural discrimination that made such recognition rare and that denied black soldiers opportunities for advancement regardless of demonstrated merit. Chen's and Sullivan's post-war lives, while different from Washington's in important ways, also reflected incomplete recognition of veterans' contributions. Chen faced discrimination that limited economic opportunity despite his military service and personal capabilities. Sullivan had access to GI Bill benefits denied to many Black and Asian American veterans, enabling educational and economic advancement, but he carried psychological impacts of combat that received inadequate treatment and limited understanding. All three men had given years of their lives to military service, experienced combat's physical and psychological tolls, and contributed to victory that shaped global order for generations. Yet none received support fully commensurate with their service or sacrifice. The 60th, 70th, and 75th anniversaries of the Battle of the Bulge brought renewed attention to the engagement, with military historians, documentary filmmakers, and educational organizations examining the campaign's lesser-known aspects. Washington's engagement appeared in several documentary productions, typically as example of tactical innovation and small unit effectiveness. These productions varied in quality and attention to historical context, some providing nuanced discussion of segregation's impact, while others glossed over racial dimensions to focus narrowly on tactical mechanics. The variations reflected broader challenges in public history and military commemoration. The tension between honoring service while honestly confronting the discrimination that shaped that service. Washington's grave in Montgomery remains modest, a simple military headstone in cemetery section reserved for black veterans. The stone lists his name, dates of birth and death, rank, unit and decorations, including the Silver Star. Visitors are infrequent, mostly military history enthusiasts who have learned of his story through documentary productions or military education materials. The grave's modesty contrasts sharply with the elaborate memorials erected for some white officers whose tactical achievements were less significant, but whose race and social connections enabled more prominent recognition. The contrast is not accidental, but reflects systematic patterns of how American society distributes recognition and memorialization. Sullivan's papers, donated to Massachusetts Veterans Organization after his death, included extensive documentation of his decades-long effort to ensure Washington received appropriate recognition. The papers contain correspondence with military historians, veterans organizations, elected officials, and media outlets. Sullivan's persistence is evident in the volume and tenor of the correspondence, his repeated attempts to bring Washington's story to broader attention despite limited success for many years. The papers also document Sullivan's evolution on racial issues, his views shaped by wartime service with black soldiers and by friendship with Washington that challenged prejudices he had absorbed growing up. His personal transformation, while individual story, represents broader process through which some white Americans came to question and reject racist assumptions through direct experience contradicting those assumptions. Contemporary descendants of Washington, Chen, and Sullivan have connected through veterans organizations and historical preservation efforts. Washington's grandchildren, Chen's children, and Sullivan's nieces and nephews have participated in commemorative events together, maintaining connection across generations. These relationships represent perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the December engagement. Bonds formed in extreme circumstances, transcending racial divisions that American society tried to enforce, sustained across decades and generations, demonstrating possibility of connection across difference, even as systemic racism persisted. The tactical lessons from Washington's engagement remain relevant in contemporary military operations. The core principles apply across technological and strategic contexts. Understanding enemy behavior, creating conditions for optimal engagement, exercising patience to maximize advantage, maintaining discipline under stress. Military education continues to emphasize these principles, using Washington's December 1944 decisions as historical example that illustrates abstract concepts. The engagement demonstrates that tactical excellence emerges from human judgment rather than technological superiority alone, that individual soldiers' decisions can achieve effects disproportionate to their rank or resources, and that effective tactics often emerge from creative responses to specific situations, rather than rigid adherence to standardized doctrine. The broader historical significance of the engagement extends beyond immediate tactical results to encompass questions about military effectiveness, racial integration, and recognition of merit. Washington's tactical thinking exceeded that of many officers, demonstrating that capability was not distributed according to racial hierarchy, despite military institutional structures based on such assumptions. The engagement provided evidence, replicated in thousands of similar instances across units and theaters, that segregation reduced military effectiveness by limiting advancement opportunities for capable soldiers and by denying the military access to leadership talent wherever it emerged. These practical effectiveness arguments, combined with moral arguments about equal rights and citizenship, contributed to eventual integration of American military forces. The commemoration and study of actions like Washington's engagement serves important functions in contemporary society. The stories provide historical education about World War II and the Battle of the Bulge specifically. They offer case studies for military tactical and leadership training. They contribute to ongoing discussions about race, military service, and recognition of contribution. They honor individuals whose service deserved better acknowledgement than they received during their lifetimes. They provide inspiration through examples of competence, courage, and tactical brilliance, and they complicate simple narratives of military history by forcing engagement with the contradictions and injustices that characterized even successful military operations. The bunker no longer exists. The valley has returned to peaceful forest, and the only physical evidence of the December engagement consists of occasional artifacts recovered by metal detector enthusiasts who search former battle sites. But the tactical innovation Washington created persists in military doctrine, his approach incorporated into training and education that shapes how thousands of soldiers think about defensive operations. His name appears in historical records, memorial sites, and educational materials where future generations encounter it. His story is told in classrooms, documentary films, and commemorative events. The recognition came late and remains incomplete, but Washington's contribution to military tactical thinking is preserved and honored in ways that ensure his December 1944 decisions continue to influence military operations more than 8 decades later. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.